Ready to go? Thank you, Steve. Good morning. Today we're going to talk on many levels about the death penalty, and not the proposed financial death penalty that was put out there yesterday, but the moratorium on the death penalty that our governor has placed into effect. There are more than 12.7 million people in Pennsylvania. There are 253 men and women currently representing those Pennsylvanians in the State House and Senate. There is one judge and 12 men or women who serve on any death penalty case. There is at least one victim in each case, not to mention the family and friends affected by the tragedy. Governor Wolf recently decided to ignore us all. With the stroke of his pen, he ignored the will of Pennsylvanians expressed through their democratically elected state legislature. He overruled the judges who handled death penalty cases, and he disregarded the sentences handed down by 12 Pennsylvanians serving on each of these juries. However, the people who will be most directly affected by the governor's decisions are the victims of violent and horrific crimes. Pennsylvania crime victims deserve justice. What they are receiving from the governor is politics. If the governor wanted to initiate a moratorium on a death penalty, he could have legally pursued two options. He could have approached the legislature to try to get the law changed, or he could have filed a lawsuit in the court to seek an injunction in death penalty cases. The governor chose to pursue neither of those options. Death penalty cases involve some of the most horrific crimes in Pennsylvania. For example, one case in Chester County involved a man and a woman who brutally and repeatedly beat a 3-year-old boy. They left the boy to die in a trailer park while they reportedly had sex and went out for pizza. That little boy deserves justice. How about the animal that lived in the woods for at least 2 weeks looking at his prey? That prey, a Pennsylvania state trooper by the name of Corporal Brian Dixon. Where's his justice? Where's his justice with no death penalty? If in fact that animal is given the death penalty, he will be given a pillow and a binky rather than a syringe. Similar victims across Pennsylvania deserve justice. The families of victims should have justice. That is why I'm introducing House Resolution 143, which calls on the governor to reverse his decision and live up to his constitutional responsibility to enforce Pennsylvania laws. There is an old legal maxim that says, justice delayed is justice denied. That certainly applies to these situations. The governor has voiced support for victims in the past. His actions betray his words. I'm not saying the governor is a bad man, and I'm not saying he's heartless or doesn't care about crime victims. What I am saying is that when it comes to standing up for victims and to criminals, Governor's wolf bark is louder than his bite. Thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to introduce York County District Attorney Tom Kearney.
Each of my colleagues, 67 of us, have taken an oath to enforce the Constitution of the United States and of the laws of this Commonwealth. The governor took the same oath. We in the executive branch do not have the luxury of determining which laws given to us by the legislature that we desire to enforce. When we stick our hand up and take that oath, we swear to enforce all of the laws of this Commonwealth. The governor, also a member of the executive branch, has decided that he can pick and choose, thereby ignoring the will of the legislature and ignoring court rulings. Nothing says it better than the words of families who have lost their loved ones. I want to read to you now the letter of one family who lost their loved one in 1995. when Mark Spots went on a killing spree, taking the lives of 4 people in over 4 days in a multi-county crime spree. This letter is from David and Pauline Smith. I am writing in response to the moratorium imposed by the governor and appalled that he could do something so stupid. It is like a slap in the face to all the victims of heinous crimes. My name is Pauline Smith, the wife of David Smith, whose mother, June Rose Ollinger, was tragically murdered on February 1st of 1995, which happened 20 years ago. At the time, I was 5 months pregnant with our first child. June was looking forward to a grandchild, especially a girl, since there were no girls in the family. We had a daughter that May. June never got to see or hold her granddaughter, and our daughter never got to know her grandmother. It was a crime that made national news. Her murderer, Mark Spots, along with his girlfriend, went on a 4-day killing spree across the state of Pennsylvania, killing his brother and 3 innocent women before being caught. June was his second victim. Her murder occurred in Schuylkill County. She just arrived at her place of work when she was abducted, robbed, and taken to a secluded location. There, she was shot in the head and thrown into a creek. Her murderer drove away in her car with no respect for human life. June's voice was silenced that day. What about her rights, her family's, and all of the other victims' rights? Why do criminals get all these appeals and have more rights than their victim? Mark Spots was found guilty and given three death sentences, yet he is still living. Why should the taxpayers have to keep these criminals alive when they are given the death penalty? I believe the punishment should fit the crime. How is this justice for us, the families, or even the victim? What about justice for all? I will not be able to attend this rally, but I would appreciate it if my statement could be read. Thank you. It's now my privilege to introduce Senator John Rafferty, Republican from Montgomery County. Senator.
I want to thank the members of the House for putting together this press conference today, along with the DA's Association. Michael, well done. I issued a statement right after the governor declared his moratorium. I was agitated, angry, and upset, and surprised as many other people were here. Before I read my statement, I want to preface my comments by saying he was just elected governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to represent all the people in the Commonwealth. Not just the worst of the worst, but all the people of the Commonwealth. That includes the victims and their families. He was also elected to be Chief Executive Officer of the Pennsylvania State Police. What kind of message are you sending to the men and women of the Pennsylvania State Police who had to sit there for months while they hunted down that animal in Northeast PA? One who killed one of their fellow troopers and gravely wounded another. And now you're saying the death penalty is off the table. Talk about morale. Talk about boosting the confidence of the Pennsylvania State Police. Talk about healing their wounds. You've just reopened them. So I think it's very incumbent upon us in the legislature and with the DAs to criticize the governor for his actions. Mr. Wolf was elected governor of this great Commonwealth and was thus entrusted with executing the law. The governor's authority rests in enforcing the law, and it is not the duty of his office to substitute his judgment for that of the other 2 branches of government. We do have a 3-branch government. Whether Governor Wolf likes it or not, our law provides for the execution of individuals convicted of homicide with certain aggravating factors, like the killing of children, senior citizens, and police officers. I find it very troubling when elected executive officials in this Commonwealth substitute their judgment for that of the law. Governor Wolf, in justifying his decision to grant this moratorium, relied heavily on the bipartisan Pennsylvania Task Force and Advisory Commission created by the Senate, entrusted with conducting a study of the effectiveness of capital punishment in Pennsylvania and reporting its findings back to the Senate. As a member of the Senate and vice chairman of the Joint State Government Commission, the advisory commission responsible for administering this task force, I'm in a unique position to know this committee what it was entrusted to accomplish. I can say unequivocally the intent of the death penalty group was not to be an excuse or a tool for our governor to ignore current law. In my opinion, the governor, by granting this moratorium, is improperly holding our law hostage to a mere advisory group. That's all it is, an advisory group. The same group which has already been questioned by some as to whether it is unfairly skewed towards the death penalty opponents. When the Senate passed the resolution authorizing this advisory group, the intent was not to mandate that its recommendations be reviewed and implemented as a precedent for following our duly enacted laws. Our duly enacted laws, that means those passed by the legislature and sent to the governor. Indeed, in the past, the Joint State Government Commission has produced some very important work, but their recommendations or findings are not binding on the legislature. In my opinion, making them binding will be an unacceptable delegation of power. Governor Wolf made a political decision to protect the worst of the worst in our society and did so at the expense of the families of the victims of these heinous crimes. This was the result of a single stroke of the pen as opposed to the accepted principles of democracy. The voice of the people expressed through our jury system, and in my opinion, is contrary to our current legislation and judicial jurisprudence. The governor may oppose the death penalty, but this is far too important of a decision to rest with one person. This is a matter that should be discussed and debated with the legislature in a public fashion so that the will and opinions of the people may be expressed. And I'd like to follow the DA's lead and read a letter that was handed to me from a Montgomery County family to Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. 10 years ago this month, my beloved daughters, Heather and Lisa, and my 3.5-year-old granddaughter, Avery Johnson, were heinously butchered and murdered by the hands of a serial killer, John Eichinger. The ruthless individual was quickly captured due to the outstanding police and detective work and was later prosecuted by the Montgomery County District Attorney. He acknowledged his guilt in court of deliberately planning and causing the murder of my girls and also omitted his responsibility for the murder of Jennifer Still in 1999. He received 3 death penalties for the grieved slaying and a life sentence without parole for the murder of Jennifer Still. Thus, there was never any question of his innocence due to his own testimony and the overwhelming evidence presented in this case. Today, the murderer of my family sits comfortably on Pennsylvania's death row, while I and others must continue to quietly endure the daily sorrow of my daughter's absence and meritless appeals of their killer. Now, in addition to our grief, Governor Wolf, you have decided to place a moratorium on our state's death penalty to further suspend our mournful suffering indefinitely. Governor Wolf, where is my closure? Governor Wolf, where is my justice? Your moratorium serves to further aid the convicted destroyers of our loved ones. Therefore, sir, I beg you, please, to rescind this pointless and grievous moratorium and let true justice begin to triumph once again. Sincerely, George Greaves. Thank you. And now I'd like to present the DA of Berks County, John Adams, a friend of mine, and will speak now. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is John Adams. I am the District Attorney of Berks County. I am pleased to state that I supported Tom Wolf for governor. I am pleased with some of his initiatives, but I am disappointed that he has self-imposed a moratorium on the death penalty without any legal authority. He also imposed this moratorium without reaching out and speaking with district attorneys who are well represented here today. We never spoke to Governor Wolf at all. This decision that he made was unilateral and without consultation with those of us who prosecute cases day in and day out. We had no input into his decision. Deciding whether or not to seek the death penalty is a decision that district attorneys throughout our Commonwealth take very seriously. We do not seek this penalty unjustly. Most importantly, before we make a decision of this magnitude, we speak to the families of the victims for their input and thoughts. Governor Wolf did not speak to the families of these victims when he unilaterally imposed a moratorium. Who did he speak to? Not us, not the victims, not the prosecutors, not the police. And clearly, he did not speak to the most important people affected by this decision, the victims' families. They have suffered more than anyone, and it's time that they be heard. At this time, let me introduce to you Tricia Wirtz. Tricia Wirtz is the wife of Scott Wirtz. Scott Wirtz was a Reading police officer, gunned down in the line of duty on August 6th, 2006. His killer, Cletus Rivera, is on death row. Tricia.
Good morning. As John said, I'm Tricia Wirtz. I am the wife, or should I say widow, of slain Reading police officer Scott Wirtz. In August of 2006, my husband was shot and killed while on duty by a man who had been a criminal since he was 13 years old. He was 24 at the time he killed my husband and was wanted. In August of 2008, that killer, who testified on his own behalf, was fairly tried by a jury of his peers, found guilty, and was sentenced to death. At the time of Scott's death, we had 2 children. They were 7 and 12. They are now 21 and soon to be 16. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for me to even begin to tell you how Scott's death has devastated and affected myself, our sons, and our families. This year will be 7 years that Scott's killer will be on death row. In the past 7 years, I have learned through this whole process that the death penalty system is definitely flawed. Flawed for the victims and flawed for their families left behind. That is, not flawed for the killers. Flawed because we have to wait a lifetime because of the numerous appeals that these convicted killers are given when our loved ones weren't even given a chance by these convicted killers. Flawed because execution warrants are signed year after year for these killers, and none of them are actually executed, while we spend thousands and thousands of dollars on their appeals, their housing, etc., when it could be better spent on other needed things like education, law enforcement, healthcare, etc. Flawed also because every time an appeal happens, us families are victimized again. While justice was partially served in that Scott's killer was found guilty, justice should be served and finalized by executing his killer in a timely manner, who again, this killer was rightfully sentenced to death by a jury of his peers. I hope to see Scott's killer put to death in my lifetime. I had hoped it would happen in my parents' lifetime, but at this rate, I don't see that happening. Maybe it will happen in my children's lifetime. When I heard about Governor Wolf's moratorium on the death penalty, I was surprised, hurt, and very disappointed. First, I didn't recall ever hearing anything about him being opposed to the death penalty during his campaign. And second, that not once did I hear of him ever speaking to any of the families of these victims whose killers are on death row. We have the death penalty for a reason. Most killers don't think about being sentenced to death when they are continuing to commit a crime and commit that crime, because I believe mostly they know it's not going to ever happen. In closing, the death penalty definitely needs to be looked at, but not through moratorium and not for those sitting on death row. It needs to be looked at and changed for the victims and their families so they can stop being victimized, finally have closure, and justice can finally be served. Thank you. Sorry, I'm supposed to introduce Judy Cassidy. Her husband is Chuck Cassidy, and he was an officer who was killed also.
Good morning. First, I have to say the last time we were here, we were honoring Chuck. It's crazy. I want to thank you for inviting me to say a few words today regarding the feelings of a survivor when a loved one is killed. Sorry. As you probably know, my husband Chuck was a police officer killed in the line of duty just over 7 years ago. First, I would like to sincerely thank the City of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Police Department, the FOP, the District Attorney's Office for their continued support of me and my family. They are always there for us. When Chuck was killed and the person responsible, which I use that word lightly because I don't refer to him as that, was convicted and sentenced to death, we knew it wouldn't bring Chuck back to us. But it provided us a sense of closure that justice was done. And that would be important to Chuck as well to us. We drew some small sense of satisfaction that this person would be justifiably punished, and a life on death row in virtual isolation was that punishment. It is very important to us that this punishment not be altered, that Chuck's murder is not provided a lifestyle that is any better than the one he has now. Whether he is ever executed is not as important to us as ensuring his quality of life is not improved. That is our simple request. So I want to thank you again for this opportunity to express my feelings on this matter, and God bless all those in law enforcement, and please keep them safe. Thank you.
Good morning. We already heard from two families that are here today, and there are hundreds more victims whose perpetrators sit on death row today. In fact, there's 186 murderers on death row. Often lost in the discussion of capital punishment is true concern for the victims and their families. I also am very disappointed, Governor Wolf, that has re-victimized those families by suddenly and without any public discussion imposing a moratorium on the death penalty in Pennsylvania. We can only imagine the pain and the anguish that victims' loved ones feel when someone that they love is taken at the hands of another. For those families, the moratorium just reopens the wounds. I've been a long supporter of the death penalty, a fair, strong death penalty. And in 1995, actually, the special session on crime, I authored House Bill 1, which ensures that the governor must sign a death warrant within a specific number of days after judicial reviews, and unless a pardon is granted or the defendant's sentence is commuted. This requirement gives finality for those the victims have left behind. It leads to much needed closure. Let me be clear. Those sentenced to death are entitled to extensive review of their cases. And in fact, cases for people who have been convicted of murder and sentenced to death are the most reviewed and scrutinized cases by the judiciary. These defendants sit on death row for decades. During this time, defendants have their cases examined by both state and federal courts, usually multiple times, in order to ensure fairness. Defendants get multiple opportunities to appeal, and their claims are considered by multiple courts. But we must also have to remember the victims. Crime victims and their families suffer during this long process. Undue delays only add to the already excruciating process for the already heavily burdened family and friends of those who have been murdered. So while those sentenced to death are entitled to careful review of their cases, those cases also need finality, because the families of silenced victims need finality. So let us have an open and fair discussion about capital punishment. To that end, I pledge that the House Judiciary Committee, as chair, will hold a full and public hearing on the issue. We will invite advocates who seek to abolish capital punishment to explain their views. We will invite members of law enforcement to discuss the importance of the death penalty and how it currently is used in Pennsylvania. We will also let the people of Pennsylvania decide what they believe about this issue. But we will not forget the victims. The first thing we will do is the committee will hear testimony about the crimes that were committed. We will hold this first hearing on March 26th in Philadelphia. We will work with these prosecutors standing here today. We will hear stories of the victims. We will not turn away from the brutal details. We will bear witness to the terror and the death that these victims suffered. Because of the debate on capital punishment, we need first to remember the people who cannot participate in that debate, the innocent victims who were murdered. Thank you.
Before we take any questions, behind us are not just my colleagues in the House, but are the pictures of the victims we're referencing and talking about. The pictures reflect those who no longer have a voice. So we need to be their voice, again, for them and for their families. So I just wanted to point out that they represent victims. Any questions?
Yeah,
Brad?
What impact can the resolution have? Because that doesn't have a force of law. The Senate passed one as need to, and can't the governor just ignore it?
Sure, the governor can ignore it, but then again, he's ignored a lot by doing this moratorium. We feel there's a challenge as the chief executive to just set aside a law that was passed, which of course there are lawsuits already filed, and we're going to let that go through the process. I think the Supreme Court is going to hear the one case, but we're sending a message. We're going to send a message that at least 102 members in the House are very concerned about his decision and want him to change his mind.
So there's nothing else you feel you can do apart from the litigation that's already being undertaken? There's nothing else you can do apart from have hearings and call attention to it?
Yeah, I don't know of any legal recourse that we can do. We certainly could pass another bill. We probably wouldn't sign it. But right now, this is about being audible for our victims and make sure Pennsylvania understands that in the first weeks of office, his priority was something he never talked about, putting a moratorium on a death penalty. And I think Pennsylvania needs to be very well aware of that. Anything else? Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Good job, buddy.
Good job, Mike.
All right, guys.
Good job.